Chapter 14. "Walk him around a little," said Holt. Will glanced back at the shaggy pony, who watched him with intelligent eyes. "Come on, boy," he said, and pulled on the halter. Instantly, Tug braced his forelegs and refused to move. Will pulled harder on the rope, leaning back in his efforts to make the stubborn little pony move. Old Bob cackled with laughter. "Ha! He be stronger than you," he said. Will felt his ears reddening with embarrassment. He pulled harder. Tug twitched his ears and resisted. It was like trying to pull a house along. "Don't look at him," Holt said softly. "Just take the rope and walk away from him. He'll follow." Will tried it that way. He turned his back on Tug, seized the rope firmly, and began walking. The pony trotted easily after him. Will looked at Holt and grinned. The ranger nodded his head towards the far fence of the paddock. Will glanced across and saw a small saddle placed across the top rail of the fence. "Saddle him up," said the ranger. Tug clip-clopped docilely across to the fence. Will looped the reins around the fence rail and hefted the saddle across the pony's back. He bent down to fasten the girth straps of the saddle. "Pull 'em good and tight," old Bob advised him. Finally, the saddle was firmly in position. Will looked eagerly at Holt. "Can I ride him now?" he asked. The ranger stroked his uneven beard thoughtfully before he answered. "If you feel that's a good idea, go ahead," he said finally. Will hesitated for a moment. The phrase stirred a vague memory with him. But then eagerness overcame caution, and he put one foot into the stirrup and swung himself nimbly onto the pony's back. Tug stood unmoving. "Get up," Will said, drumming his heels against the pony's side. For a moment nothing happened. Then Will felt a small tremor of movement go through the pony's body. Suddenly, Tug arched his muscular little back and shot straight into the air, all 4 feet leaving the ground at the same time. He twisted violently to one side, came down on his front legs and kicked his rear legs high into the sky. Will sailed neatly over the pony's ears, turned a complete somersault in the air, and crashed on his back in the dirt. He picked himself up, rubbing his back. Tug stood nearby, ears up, watching him intently. "Now why did you go and do a silly thing like that?" the eyes seemed to say. Old Bob leaned against the fence, sides heaving with laughter. Will looked at Holt. "What did I do wrong?" he asked. Holt ducked under the fence rails and walked across to where Tug stood, watching the two of them expectantly. He handed the bridle back to Will, then laid one hand on his shoulder. "Nothing if this were an ordinary horse," he said, "but Tug has been trained as a ranger horse." "What's the difference?" Will interrupted angrily, and Holt held his hand up for silence. "The difference is, each ranger horse has to be asked before a rider mounts him for the first time," said Holt. "They're trained that way so that they can never be stolen." Will scratched his head. "I've never heard of such a thing," he said. Old Bob smiled as he walked forward. "Not too many folk has," he said. "That's why ranger horses never get stolen." "Well," said Will, "what do you say to a ranger horse before you mount him?" Holt shrugged. "It varies from horse to horse. Each one responds to a different request." He gestured toward the larger horse. "My horse, for example, responds to the words, 'Permettez-moi.'" "Permettez-moi?" Will echoed. "What sort of sounds are they?" "They're Gallic. They mean, 'Will you allow me?'" "His parents came from Gallica, you see," Holt explained. Then he turned to old Bob. "What are the words for Tug here, Bob?" Bob screwed up his eyes, pretending that he couldn't remember. Then his face cleared. "Ah, yes, I recall," he said. "This one here, he needs to be asked, 'Do you mind?' afore you get on his back." "Do you mind?" Will repeated, and Bob shook his head. "Don't say it to me, youngster. Say it in the horse's ear." Feeling a little silly and not at all sure that the others weren't having a joke at his expense, Will stepped forward and said softly in Tug's ear, "Do you mind?" Tug whinnied softly. Will looked doubtfully at the two men, and Bob nodded in encouragement. "Go on, climb on now. Young Tug won't harm you now." Very carefully, Will swung himself onto the pony's shaggy back once again. His back still ached from the previous attempt. He sat there a moment. Nothing happened. Then he tapped his heels gently into Tug's ribs. "Come on, boy," he said softly. Tug's ears twitched up and he stepped forward at an easy walk. Still cautious, Will let him walk around the paddock once or twice, then tapped again with his heels. Tug broke into a gentle trot. Will moved easily to the rhythm of the horse's movement, and Holt looked on approvingly. The boy was an instinctive rider. The ranger unclipped the short length of rope that held the paddock gate closed and swung the gate wide open. "Take him out, Will," he called, "and see what he can really do." Obediently, Will turned the pony towards the gate, and, as they passed through into the open ground beyond, tapped once more with his heels. He felt the muscular little body beneath him bunch momentarily, then Tug broke into a fast gallop. The wind rushed past Will's ears as he leaned forward over the pony's neck, encouraging him to an even greater speed. Tug's ears pricked upwards in response, and he went even faster than before. He was like the wind. His short legs were a blur of motion as he carried the boy at full speed towards the edge of the trees. Gently, not sure how the pony would react, Will applied pressure to the left-hand rein. Instantly, Tug veered to the left, racing away from the trees at an angle. Will kept the gentle pressure on the rein until Tug was headed once again back towards the paddock. Will gasped in amazement and he saw how far they had come. Holt and old Bob were tiny figures in the distance now, but they grew rapidly larger as Tug flew over the rough grass towards them. A fallen log loomed in front of them, and, before Will could make any effort to avoid it, Tug had gathered himself, steadied, and leapt over the obstacle. Will let out a shout of excitement, and the pony whinnied briefly in reply. They were almost back to the paddock now, and Will pulled gently on both reins. Instantly, Tug slowed to a canter, then a trot, finally coming down to a walking pace, as Will maintained the pressure on the reins. He brought the pony to a standstill beside Holt. Tug tossed his shaggy head and whinnied again. Will leaned forward and patted the pony on the neck. "He's terrific," he said breathlessly. "He's as fast as the wind." Holt nodded gravely. "Perhaps not quite as fast as the wind," he said, "but he can certainly cover ground." He turned to the old man. "You've done well with him, Bob." Old Bob ducked his head in appreciation and leaned forward to pat the shaggy little pony in his turn. He had spent his life breeding, training, and preparing the Ranger Corps horses, and this one ranked among the best he'd seen. "He'll keep that pace all day," he said fondly. "Run them fat battle horses into the ground, this one will. Youngster rides him well too, Ranger, don't he?" Holt stroked his beard. "Not too badly," he said. Bob was scandalized. "Not too badly? You're a hard man, Ranger. Youngster sat him light as a feather through that jump." The old man looked up at Will, sitting astride the pony, and nodded in appreciation. "You don't saw away at them reins like some do neither. Got a light touch with that horse's soft mouth, he has." Will grinned at the old horse trainer's praise. He sneaked a quick look at Holt, but the ranger was as grave-faced as ever. "He never smiles," Will thought to himself. He went to dismount, then stopped himself hurriedly. "Is there anything I should say to him before I get off?" Bob laughed aloud. "Ha! No, youngster. Once said, and young Tug here will remember. As long as it's you who's riding him." Relieved, Will climbed down. He stood beside the pony, and Tug shoved him affectionately with his head. Will glanced at the apple barrel. "Could I give him another?" he asked. Holt nodded. "Just one more," he said. "But don't go making a habit of it. He'll be too fat to run if you feed him all the time." Tug snorted loudly. Apparently he and Holt were at odds over how many apples a pony should have in a day. Will spent the rest of the day getting tips on riding technique from old Bob and learning how to look after and repair Tug's saddle and harness, as well as the finer points of caring for the little horse. He brushed and curried the shaggy coat until it shone, and Tug seemed to appreciate his efforts. Finally, worn out, his arms aching with the effort, he had slumped to a seat on a hay bale, which of course had to be the exact moment when Holt walked into the stable. "Come along," he said. "No time to be lolling around doing nothing. We'd best get moving if we're to be home before dark." And, so saying, he tossed a saddle across the back of his horse. Will didn't bother to protest that he hadn't been lolling around, as the ranger put it. For a start, he knew it would be no use. And secondly, he was excited by the fact that they would be riding back to Holt's little cottage by the edge of the forest. It seemed that the two horses were to become a permanent part of their establishment. He realized now that Holt's horse had obviously been so before, and that the ranger had only been waiting until Will had shown his ability to ride and to bond with Tug before reclaiming him from his temporary home in old Bob's stable. The horses whinnied to each other from time to time as they trotted back through the dim green forest. for all the world as if they were carrying on their own conversation. Will was bursting with questions he wanted to ask, but by now he was wary of chattering too much in the ranger's presence. Finally, he could contain himself no longer. "Halt," he said experimentally. The ranger grunted. Will took that as a sign he could continue speaking. "What's your horse's name?" the boy asked. Holt looked down at him. His horse was slightly larger than Tug, although nowhere near the size of the giant battle horses kept in the Baron's stable. "I believe it's Abelard," he said. "Abelard?" Will repeated. "What kind of name is that?" "It's Gallic," said the ranger, obviously putting an end to the conversation. They rode a few kilometres further in silence. The sun was lowering over the trees now, and their shadows were long and distorted on the ground in front of them. Will studied Tug's shadow. The pony seemed to have enormously long legs and a ridiculously short body. He wanted to call Holt's attention to it, but thought that such a frivolous observation would not impress the ranger. Instead, he summoned the courage to ask another question that had been occupying his thoughts for some days. "Holt," he said again. The ranger sighed briefly. "What now?" he asked. His tone definitely did not encourage further conversation. However, Will pressed on. "Remember how you told me a ranger was responsible for Morgorath's defeat?" Holt grunted. "Well, I was just wondering, what was the ranger's name?" the boy asked. "Names aren't that important," Holt said. "I really can't remember." "Was it you?" Will continued, sure that it was. Holt turned that level, unsmiling gaze on him again. "I said names aren't important," he repeated. There was a silence between them for some seconds. Then the ranger said, "Do you know what is important?" Will shook his head. "Supper is important," said the ranger, "and we'll be late for it if we don't hurry." He clapped his heel into Abelard's side, and the horse shot away like an arrow from Holt's own bow, leaving Will and Tug far behind in a matter of seconds. Will touched Tug's sides with his own heels, and the little pony raced off in pursuit of his bigger friend. "Come on, Tug," Will urged. "Let's show them how the real ranger horse can run."